thank you very much for the kind introduction. Sarab and I were sitting in the back row there, listening to the wonderful stuff that Emma was sharing about creativity. And we thought, well, why don't we do this in a bit more creative way as well, and not be like the typical academics? And particularly because we realized that I was planning all the nasty things to say, and Sarab was planning all the good things to say, and we thought, well, why don't we go on stage together, and why don't we go disagree with each other on stage? We thought that would be a more creative format on a Saturday morning than doing it the usual academic way, and I hope you'll engage with us in this way as well. It's incredibly exciting to be here. The Promise Foundation is the only Indian member of the Global Alliance. The Global Alliance is the global umbrella association of 43 national associations of public relations. I started my professional life in India working in Worli in Mumbai at Siemens. It's always a great joy to be back in India. Amit asked me, can you speak about reputation research and what academics have to say about reputation? And I thought, well, yeah, I can do that, but it's actually not a very interesting topic because you can read all about it. And instead, I wanted to find out really for today, what is the reputation that academics have in the eyes of non-academics? And when you ask that kind of question, and you will know this, reputation is about relationship. So to answer that question, we'll need to look at what is the relationship between the practice and academia. And that's when I realized the question that's very often asked, and you probably have it on your minds as well, what are PR academics good for anyway? And that's usually asked in a bit of an exasperated way, and Sarab has been trying to answer that question in her part of the world as well. And I actually think that the gap, particularly for PR education, is smaller than we pretend it to be. Can I just do a quick poll? Who of you in this room, and I just need a show of hands, is a practitioner, at least most of the time? As in, who's an industry PR practitioner as opposed to an educator? Of all of you who practice, can you leave your hand up if you sometimes also teach? Ah, see? This is what I mean. We pretend that the gap is big between academia and teaching on the one hand and the industry on the other hand. But I actually think that that gap is much smaller than it is. But it serves a function, and now comes my first nasty part. It serves a function to pretend that that gap is actually bigger than it is. And let me explain what I mean with that. And I'm thinking that Sarab is going to disagree with me. I hope she's going to disagree with me. So here's what we pretend versus what we do. If you ask academics about the practice, they'll say things like, gosh, I wish those agencies would give my graduates better paying jobs, because really what, say, X100 or any other agencies paying is a pittance. I've trained these kids for 3-4 years, and now they're making something that can't even allow them to move out of their parents' home. And I wish the practice would get more involved in what we do in research, because that would make our research more accurate. If you ask practitioners like yourselves, the industry like yourselves, and this is true for practically any country I operate in, they tell you, produce better graduates if you want us to pay them better. Because what they learn is not enough to actually make the value creating once they start working for us. And the other thing that you also hear is get more involved. Make sure that you, as an academic, are more out there in the practice so that you know what problems we have. I think this debate is a fake. It actually hides something that serves both sides relatively well, and it's happening underneath the surface of this debate. Because if you look globally at some of the things that are not changing, in spite of this debate between academics and industry going on for decades in practically every country, what is not changing is curricula. Curricula in practically every country in PR are relatively stagnant. They hardly ever change, and probably SCORE is an exception because it's a new school and it has the opportunity to look at things in a fresh way. But if you look at the traditional large universities that teach communication management, curricula are relatively conservative, so they're not changing. What's also not changing, sadly, are salaries, particularly not for entry-level graduates, bachelor degree holders. So what makes me think is, well, I think that debate about, well, produce better graduates and make them earn a better pay, that's a fake debate. Because we go on having that without actually changing the things that need to be changed to change the basis of this. The other thing that I worry about is that we still have, unlike any other professional service firms, we still have huge gaps between top practitioners, quality gaps I mean, top practitioners and entry-level practitioners. This, I think, is the great weakness of our profession, that gap is not closing. Quite unlike the gap in law, quite unlike the gap in accounting, quite unlike the gap in strategy consulting. That gap remains. So there are three things that haven't changed, even though we keep bitching at each other, industry and academia. And I think it's because we're actually in alignment about a number of things. If you ask what we're actually doing, we're producing good enough graduates, and both sides are fine with it. Academics produce good enough, not excellent, but good enough graduates, and the industry buys good enough graduates. Why are we in alignment here? Well, because it serves the actual inherent goals of both sides. For academics, it keeps the opportunity costs low for universities. And the opportunity cost for an academic is, I want to spend as much time as possible on research. That means if I can spend as little time as possible on producing graduates, that's good for me, because then I can do more research. I don't mean this for every individual that teaches in universities, but I mean it as a system. The same is true for the other side, for the right side of my slide. The inherent interest of the industry is to keep hiring costs low. So this is where the two systems, in my view, are in alignment. They each have a special sense of what is costly to them, and they want to keep it low. The agreement, the secret agreement here is, let's produce good enough graduates so that we're keeping costs low on both sides. I'd like to call this a collusive complacency. And this collusive complacency is happening at the expense of graduates and is serving both sides just fine. This is the reason why curricula haven't changed, qualification gaps haven't changed, and basically salaries haven't moved either for the past years. So that's the first nasty thing I had to say. I'm just going to stop and see if Sarab wants to. Okay. That sounds dangerous. You're probably preparing a nasty counter-argument. But of course, that's only one part of the story. The other part is the research part. And here's where I think the gap between practice and academia that we pretend is so big is actually less harmful than we think. And in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say here is, it's fine to leave researchers to do their own work, because they're usually, in their own way, ahead of the practice. And I'll show you in a second why I come to that conclusion. And again, I'm happy to have a debate about this. If you look at, roughly speaking, what PR research is produced in the leading academic institutions of the world, and driven by academics like Sarab, you'll see there's waves of research attention, and I roughly date those in decades. So in the 1950s, the research focus was mostly on how do PR and journalism relate to each other. There's lots of research output about that. Peaking in the 70s, 80s, and then basically globally dropping down after that. It's not going away, but it's just had its peak a few decades ago. That was then followed by a second wave of research attention about the relationship between PR and management. Something that also is still ongoing, but that had its peak some time ago as well. And you'll see it's a relationship issue too. The third relationship issue that comes as a wave of research attention is, Imar just mentioned this as well, the relationship between PR and all the other parts of companies and agencies that produce content, marketing for example, CSR, lobbying, etc., etc. Because it's become much easier to produce content, PR is in a competitive field, both in-house as well as in agencies. That means the research focus has shifted as well to the relationship between PR and all other content-producing parts of the organization. If you look at some cutting-edge PR research today, it has moved on already. It's moved on to looking at, well, how does PR relate to everybody else that can insert themselves into public conversations by producing their own content, by producing their own videos, by producing their own blogs. That currently is a wave of research and that produces some valuable content for the problems of today. The nature of those relationship shifts as well as, of course, I'll just skip this slide if I may so that we have more time to actually later discuss. So PR research today is, at least the cutting edge part of it, focuses on that last relationship trauma, the fact that practically anybody can produce content these days and make it accessible to the rest of the world. What does that mean for PR? And that's what PR researchers are, at least the cutting edge ones, are focusing on today. Now, if you compare that to the practice, remember I was trying to look at how helpful is that gap. If you compare that to the practice, and I'd just like to go back to what I know has been discussed here at this conference before, the Global Communications Report, and some data around that. The Global Alliance was involved in the Global Communications Report, and I'd also like to refer to a project that the Global Alliance is doing by looking at all the professional standards across the world. I'm doing this because I want to show that what the practice is worrying about is not nearly as cutting edge as what researchers are worrying about today. And let me just quote very selectively from the Global Communications Reports. Practitioners across the world, at least the ones that answered the survey of the Global Communications Report, practitioners say that the practice is becoming more complex, more strategic, and more challenging. This is really not a surprise, but then if you ask, well, how is it becoming more complex and more strategic and more challenging? There is a difference in in-house and agency perspective. But there is also, and this is what I worry about, there is also a relatively conservative take on what change means. So the change is expected to come from technology, and the change is expected to come from content. That I find is not a cutting edge worry, because it's a worry that 10 years ago would have been the same. 15 years ago it would have been the same. 20 years ago, it probably also would have been the same. In fact, it was the same when I was a PR student. And the practitioners expect investments, therefore, in social media, which is a channel rather than a strategy, and in content. And the most important skill for the practice is, well, let me ask you, what do you think are most of the practitioners, the ones that were part of the Global Communications Report, what do they think is going to be the most important skill for the practice in future? What do you think came out of that? Digital? Anything else? Storytelling. Verbal messages, strategic planning, and writing. This is content producing. And digital is a channel, of course. But I worry about this. I worry about this being the same worry that the same people would probably have said 10 years ago. The producing of content, be it verbal, be it written, be it as a story, or be it as digital content. I worry about this being a worry of yesteryear. So the PR practice today is actually one wave behind, at least one wave behind the research community. It is focusing on the content part of our jobs, and it is focusing on the difficult relation between what PR can produce as content and what other parts of companies can produce as content. A piece that suggests that we need to worry about this is a project in the Global Alliance. We call it the Global Body of Knowledge Project. What we did there is we looked at, and this is ongoing, but in the first phase we looked at all the professional standards that are available across the world, and we looked at overlaps. And so these were 91 professional standards, and the most significant similarities between nations that have professional standards are the ones that you see in the big bubble here. The similarities that they have are about writing, oral communication, public speaking, and digital content literacy. This is about content and messaging. This is SOS, sending out stuff, rather than thinking about how am I managing relationships. I worry about this. And on the other hand, I don't worry about it because the PR research community is one step ahead of the practice community in this case. So I'm going back to my second key point here. The gap between practice and academia is actually less harmful than we think. I'd like to call it instrumental independence. Both sides are independent of each other when it comes to research. We tend to worry about this. I don't think we should, because it leaves PR research the free space to think about the next wave, rather than about the wave that the practice is worrying about today. Because the PR practice today is preparing for the challenges of yesterday, and the PR research today needs to identify the challenges of tomorrow. I'll just flip through quickly through what I think those are, because this is highly hypothetical. I just want to show you this slide because it shows something fundamental. We've been talking about online communication for the past 15 years. You have, I have, Sarab has. But last year was actually the first year, 2015 was the first year in which the amount of time that humanity spent online was higher than the amount of time spent in non-online media. That was the ultimate turning point. And what that means, I think, is that we need to start thinking about the next waves, both of what are the next waves of problems and what are the next waves of research content that need to be produced. I think it can be things like, what does PR do when there are robots producing content? So basically non-human content producers. What does PR do when we have more and more organizations with no poor management? I'm thinking of Airbnb, or other forms of sharing economy. What does PR do when we're in the so-called post-truth kind of public debate? Just look at the elections in the US currently. And it's not as if these topics are very exotic. The media are picking these topics up already. PR needs to think about this, and this is what I think PR research can do for the PR practice. So what does that mean? I do have one nice thing to say. We can be better at this together. What kind of can PR industry and academics achieve together? I think we should end the collusive complacency because it is costly, at least for the graduates we produce. I think we should preserve the independence of research, but make it more instrumental for practice and make sure that the PR research really focuses on the next wave that is relevant for the practice as well. I'm going to ask Sarab to hopefully agree in some parts with me. I'm not looking forward to the debate.
Thank you so much, Gregor.
We probably need some technical help to switch to the next presentation. Thank you.
It's such a nice transition to talk about creativity to academics and to research. And I'm sure that the minute we say the word research, some of you would say that this is perhaps the time to go out and take that important call, or perhaps you would be looking forward to the tea break that follows this session afterwards. But Gregor and I decided that we would be creative when we start talking about academics and research, and very importantly, the role that research plays in building corporate reputation. So a little bit about the Institute for Public Relations, which I'm representing today. I am Sarab Kochhar. I'm a researcher to begin with. I'm a nerd. I love maths. I love numbers. I love crunching the data. I love looking at the charts. I love looking at what the data means, and a lot of things which at times would not be described as creative in its own terms. The Institute for Public Relations is an independent foundation. We are a non-profit, and the best part about my job is that I get to work on projects that matters to the profession, and that's how we and Global Alliance work together. We kind of identify things that are important for the profession, and we work on the research projects that professionals or practitioners can put to use on an everyday basis. We are not a membership-based model, which is great news, which means that everything on our website is absolutely free for everyone to download. We are supported by generous support from supporters and even from our board as well. We have a research newsletter which goes out every week. You can subscribe to that newsletter. You can look at the research that we do, and I'll talk about some of the research that we have done recently and how you as a professional can use that in your everyday jobs. This is our website. You can go and subscribe to our newsletter. We have different commissions or centers that we do. We have a commission on organizational communication. We also have a digital and a social media research center which does research, path-breaking research on different topics like employee engagement or social media, and even behavioral insights and research as well. Some of the research areas: stakeholder engagement, employee communication, reputation management, very, very important, and measurement and evaluation. So we are collaborating with AMAC and doing the measurement month this month as well. These are two of the research reports we just launched a couple of years back, but it is something which talks about the best practices in employee communication and how you would use the research and best practices to apply that to employee communication and internal communication as well. This is a white paper we have on big data. It's all free of cost again, and then we did another study on diversity. Talking about the presentation for today, when I spoke with Amit and we were talking about research in reputation, the idea was not to come here and talk about how important research is or how important research is in building reputation, but the idea was to actually bring a fresher thinking. The idea was to bring and talk about what are some new ways in research that we could use, what is it that academics are doing which would actually mean a lot for the practice, and that's what I did. I did the homework. I looked at multidisciplinary ways of how you could actually use research. What are some of the new tools and technologies that we as practitioners could use and use that to build reputation? Talking about what Gregor was talking about, that there is a big divide between the academia and the practice. That's what we at Institute for Public Relations are trying to solve and make sure that the academia and practice come together. The interesting part of my job is that I work with the Institute for Public Relations, but I also work with APCO worldwide in their Washington, D.C. office. And what that means is that I'm very well grounded in everyday client work that comes, but also go back to the Institute for Public Relations and use research and work with academics to make sure that every research that we do is cutting edge and is actually very applicable to the profession as well. When we talk about reputation, and when I was looking at reputation, I really realized, and I'm sure Gregor would agree, and a lot of research kind of talks about how the environment for any organization is so rapidly evolving that you cannot even put a finger on saying what is any more important for the organization. Is it the digital? Is it the internal constituencies? Is it the external part? It's something which changes every minute. It's something which brings challenges for an organization and we as communicators or practitioners on an everyday basis. And coupled with that, going back to how diversity and multi-generational differences bring along, I think there's a lot of research being done on millennials and what do they prefer, what are the brands that they like, how is it that we could capture them as an important audience. Another thing which is coming and becoming very important, especially from an employee engagement perspective, is how do you tell the right story? Not only to your consumers, but also to your employees as well. How do you bring the leadership around a common narrative as well, which I think is becoming all the more important for an organization to understand given the digital space as well. Another research which comes across very interesting, and I think you all would find it very interesting, is the lack or the crises of organizational listening. Research says that 80% of the organization communication resources are only devoted to speaking. And I can actually talk more about the research if anyone is interested offline, and I can talk about how the research time and again says that how many channels do you have or whichever technology or tools that you use, there has been a crisis of what is called the organizational listening, which is a very important concept as well. And that doesn't stop the kind of libel cases or even the reputation risk that comes along with the social media. And also, I found a research which perhaps some of you would find very interesting, is that 50% of employees who left or lost their jobs kept the corporate confidential data, and 40% of them plan to use it in their new roles, which is a very recent survey by Cemented, and a lot of research time and again talks about the reputation risk organizations are at. I don't want to go through the long laundry list of what a good reputation can influence, but I would definitely want to point out towards one thing, that if you go down the list of the things that I have here, a good reputation influencing your employees' pride or your investors' confidence, all this could actually be substantiated or found or really supported by good and well-done research. So it's very important that when we talk about the tangible and intangible results of good corporate reputation, good research can actually strengthen that or help us find the loopholes or the issues or things that we need to work on. As I just mentioned, research can help us assess the relationship, it can talk about relationship outcomes, it can also help identify the issues which become very important. But here is where the real presentation would like to talk about is what is so unique about research, and can you be creative in research, especially for building corporate reputation? And some of you might think, no, it's not possible. How can you be creative in research? And what is the academic world, or what are researchers doing to bring a newer or fresher understanding of research and corporate reputation? Going through what people are actually doing, stakeholder audits, reputation audits, employee surveys, consumer panels, all this is fine. But what else you as a practitioner can do? For those of you who love maths like me, I have another formula that perhaps you could use. Reputational capital could also be calculated by the difference averaged over time between market capitalization and the liquidation value of assets. I'm sure after this you will start hearing what my next slide is, but that's the point of bringing this slide, that we don't have to follow or look at the formulas or reputation quotients by companies or by research firms that are already there. I think this is the simpler formula. If you look at reputation as performance and behavior coupled with communication, and if you as a practitioner would understand these three components of corporate reputation and conduct research around these areas, you have solved the problem of research and reputation. If you can just take a minute and say, when I talk about corporate reputation, can I make sure that I align or I understand the corporate performance coupled with corporate behavior? But very important part is the communications part of it. If I can get these three bite-sized pieces and wrap it around my head and understand what are the metrics around those, or what are the ways I could conduct research around those, I think you can answer many client questions around the client budget or the time constraints or the expertise that you would have. So that's the new way of thinking about measuring reputation as well. That's the new way of thinking about corporate research or marketing research as well. How the organization is performing, how the organization is behaving then. And then, are there confusion between the communication with the performance and behavior? So this is just a quick template for comprehensive reputation management. You can look at these metrics like financial performance, employee talent, social responsibility, governance. And the great thing about this model is that this is something which is very dynamic and customizable. You could actually pick this up and say, for my client, this is an important component, which is the performance, or this is more important when I talk about the behavior part of it, and I can make that as a way of understanding corporate reputation, measuring it, and also building it forward. So that's one way of how research is thinking about corporate reputation. Another perspective I want to bring is use of behavioral or psychology to understand public relations. I'm sure some of you would already be reading about behavioral insights. You'll be surprised to know that the executive orders from the President Obama says that every communication program that is devised in the White House should definitely take into account the behavioral insights and the learnings that come out of that. That's the importance of behavioral insights that's being recognized by governments across the world. If you look at the same kind of executive orders, the UK government is doing something very similar. And the organizations are really getting an understanding how the narrative, storytelling, and behavioral science could be used to understand communication and public relations. So I would highly encourage, if anyone is interested, we can definitely discuss it further, and I can point out you to many different literature and interesting things that you could learn about behavioral science in action. Basically, how do you understand behaviors? How do you assess the implications of these behaviors is very important and very critical for organizations today. So one of the things that we have been talking about, and in the first presentation, was also about data insights. A lot of the discussion around big data and its role in public relations and communications brings another level of discussion of saying, you have all this big data, but how do you use it? At times when I work with APCO and we work with clients, they would say, we have the data, but we don't know there are these silos between all the departments in an organization, and we are kind of repeating the same surveys. We did not use the survey data from HR, or we did not use the results from the market survey that we did, and we are doing it all over again. The questions are similar, or they are not important for us. So I think the next point is a Cisco case study, which kind of brings together how Cisco is using big data, but it's using big data to build reputations, to understand their key messages, and to also make sure that they draw business insights from the data that they get. I think I worked with Cisco to develop a white paper which you can download from the IPR website, which is about big data and how you draw insights. And one of the biggest challenges Cisco was facing was, what is important for our Cisco key markets? how do you understand what the narrative or what people are talking about? And is Cisco present in that market, or is Cisco present in that key messages? And this is what they found. This is a new way of visualizing all the chat or scatter or things around Cisco as an organization. This is an organization in California, which is a startup called Quid. And they do network analyses, and they look at all the discussion or messages around the organization, and they present this in this network formula. And all the nodes that you see, like on the right hand side, if you see the Internet of Things, or you see the orange graphs and the dots, they basically represent the messages or the chatter or conversations in the market and where Cisco is present. The more dense the network is, the more the people are talking about that topic in simpler words. So Cisco actually thought we would use technology, we would use data, but we need to understand how and what people are talking about us, and are we present in that important discussion or not. That's something which is very important for strategy for implementation as well. And what they found from the top narratives and from all the big data was how security is a growing concern for them, and whether they are present in that discussion or not. So with all that data, with the insights that we draw, or from building that reputation, this is what they found. And that's where the strategy came. That's where the strategy for the communications department was to make sure that the key messages or anything that they talk about is around that key message. And the results were fantastic for sure. So what I'm trying to bring today is not to talk about primary research or secondary research or how every practitioner should definitely conduct research or how important it is for building reputation, because if you talk about research and if you talk about reputation, it starts from the very beginning when you want to understand your stakeholders, or it starts from when you want to understand the key messages. But I think what is more important is to understand what are some new and interesting or innovative ways that you can actually apply to your practice or to your everyday work, and understand that's where we could bring in research and we could apply that. So I think that's where Gregor and I were talking about. We never wanted this kind of a session to be more academic in research, but more as a discussion of learning and discussing with you as to what you do in your everyday jobs, to how much of the research do you use, and how do you apply new and innovative ways to build corporate reputations or build reputations for your clients. So I think that's the end of the presentation, but we want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about some questions, some of your thoughts, or anything that you would have as an experience when we talk about the teaching or research as well. Thank you.
Excellent. So the idea behind both of them was that, can we have microphone passed on that please? To the extreme end, that would be wonderful. So it's fantastic that actually they cut down their presentation time to let extra time for Q&A.
Just a question and a comment from both of you on measurement. How are you sort of addressing that at the education stage and at research? Any ideas, practical ideas that we can use in everyday sort of client engagement?
Thank you so much. I think when we talk about measurement, what I was talking about, and when I was describing the three components of reputation, which is the performance, behavior, and communication, that's quite practical, because if you start looking at those three components and even start at a very basic level adding the metrics or jotting down what would describe as the behavior or performance or communication, I think that's a very good starting point, because when we conduct research, especially research on reputation, every organization is so unique in the way they are looking and defining their internal and external constituencies or stakeholders. And that's where what we found interesting in research was, how can you make sure that your research is not siloed in the organization? Very important. can you just sit with the HR and understand what the annual employee survey said, or what did the customer survey said, or what are the things that the organization found when they did a particular event. So I think very important is to look at all that information and say, all these are very important components of reputation, and that's what I'm going to use as a measurement tool for one of the things or one of the measurement methodology that you develop. So I think that's one of the very basic starting points when we talk about measurement in corporate reputation.
That's of course a $1 million question that you just asked, both for the practice as well as for researchers today. I'll give one contrary perspective on this. I agree with you that we need to have an answer to that question, and I'm going to give you two parts of that answer in a second. At the same time, I always find, let's not always obsess about measurements, because the legal counsel of a company is also not worried about measurement that much. Why not? Because that person is also showing his or her contribution to problem solving of the organization. So we need to also admit and be less defensive about it, that we're problem solvers of specific problems for an organization, for which there sometimes just aren't ways of measuring our success. And again, other functions have the same challenge, and they're not as defensive about this as we are, or traumatized by it as we are. That doesn't make that question go away. Let me give you a source of what I think is an organization that does this currently best globally, and that is the UK Government Communication Service. It is basically the central office that coordinates all the communication offices of the UK government. And what they do is online available. You can download their measurement tools and their measurement requirements that they're held accountable by. Of course, they do that because they're spending tax money, but it is probably the most sophisticated and most applicable piece of direction that you can get on measurement today.
This is Satya from Text 100. This question is for Gregor. First, I found your concept of collusive complicity to be quite interesting. So how do you really end this collusive complicity? What is the key to ending?
What's the key to ending the collusive complacency? I think what we're doing now is part of it. Meaning we need to be more honest, both the industry side as well as the research side or the academic side, is that we're engaging in a bit of a secret pact. And laying that out and being honest about it is that we're not actually being helpful for creating smart graduates in the next generation is the first step. The second step that we obviously need to do, and I'm going to make an economic argument now, is that we need both sides again, we need to make the argument that there's actually more value creation by investing more in education rather than in investing just enough in education. That's an economic argument, which industry and researchers can make together. But it starts here. It starts with conferences like these that thankfully have a role for Sarab and myself, or types like us speaking about this kind of stuff, and people like Sarab and I not pretending that research always has the answers to everything, but actually pointing out problems.
And I think another point that we at IPR is doing a lot is to work with organizations to identify where are the research gaps. And that's where, like the studies that I was talking about, big data or even employee communication, all these projects were funded by big organizations like GE and Southwest, and they really understand the need for this research, and that's why they're collaborating with academics and researchers to find the answers. I think that really brings the importance in the application of that research alive on an everyday basis, I think.
I'm not part of IPR, unless Sarab, so I can say with all credibility that is a fantastic bunch of people who are doing exactly that kind of bridge building, and you can download their stuff as well. So if you go on the IPR site,
it's all free.
It's all free.
Hi, my name is Priyanka. I'm from Gregor Halff. My question is, you rightly said that what we study in college and PR is totally different what we do on field, on job. So what do you think, as in like yesterday it was discussed that PR industry now looking for hiring more MBAs and advertisement professionals. So what do you think is going to be the future for the PR institutes in India, or maybe companies should, now should focus more on imbibing those skills in the graduates which they hire or MBA which they hire. So what do you think the education is going to take place in PR specifically per se?
There's a bit of an echo here, so if I'm not making sense in answering your question, stop me immediately. You were asking about dinosaurs, right? You're asking us what is the education part of the equation? What is the education part of the solution? Where's PR education going?
Yes, in the future, what you think is going to be the future, because now PR industry is looking to have more MBAs and advertisement professionals. Yeah. So where do these institutes and this research part will play the role?
So I don't have a normative answer to this. I'm going to give an empirical answer to this. If you look at, sorry for being a researcher here. Yeah. If you look at the institutes that are churning out graduates with the relatively speaking, with the highest entry pay, that gives you an indication of them doing something right. And typically those are, I'll have to confess, not schools of social sciences, nor even schools of PR, but those are very often business schools that have integrated PR into the business curriculum rather than into liberal arts or social sciences curriculum. What they do, what they get right, is making PR part of the value creation story, or the competitive positioning of organizations, as one of many tools. And that requires graduates to think of PR as a business tool and to always equate that back to the strategic or competitive goals of an organization rather than just to the output or messaging output goals of an organization. That's hard to do because that requires a full set of business curricula being put around the PR or common curriculum. But the ones that do typically churn out highly successful graduates, at least by the standards of them being able to call for a relatively high pay. So I think that's where part of the future is.
I think even in the US, when you look at the curriculums and how they're changing, and any discussions that happens in these associations, public relations associations, they're making sure that a lot of business skills and even financial or business basic communications is added to the PR education as one of the prerequisites or requisites to graduate. So I think they are definitely recognizing how organizations which are very global in nature need to understand, the employees need to understand the business aspect of their work as well.
Thanks. Hi, it's Anne from Text 100. I disagree with the collusive complacency, to be honest, and I've tweeted about it and I'd love to discuss it with you more. And I think that the industry has a huge role to play in challenging the curriculum because, as someone said earlier, when we get interns into text in all of our markets, all of them say, oh my God, what we're learning at college is totally different to what you're doing in the work that we're doing for our clients today. That's just an observation. My second point was that when you're talking about the curriculum and putting it into business schools and stuff like that, I think part of the challenge that we face, and I'm sure everybody here in this room, particularly in India, does too, is hiring great talent. And I think we would pay more, for sure, if we could get great talent. And I think that part of the reason why we can't get great talent is because the reputation of our industry, often in India, I think, I spoke to a journo here the other day and she said that PR is often at the bottom rung of the ladder and the reputation is not good. How can you guys in the world of academia and in the International PR Association and stuff like that help us to come up with the evidence to prove the value of communications in the larger corporate picture? How can you help us improve our reputation?
Thanks for disagreeing with me on the first part, though.
You're welcome.
And I was hoping somebody would.
There's always one of it.
Let me get back to that in a second. How can PR, or rather, how can the Academy help you on that one? I think you're being actually too kind to the Academy by saying, by blending out that we're at fault here, because what we're doing in most cases is that we're simply being lazy. We're not being responsive to the industry needs. Why? Because changing a curriculum needs a lot of time. That time is going to be taken away from doing research, and academics get promoted not on their great teaching, but on their great research. So at least for our part, on the research side of that conducive complacency, I think we're really doing something fundamentally wrong there. We're throwing graduates over the fence that you are then retraining or upskilling at your expense. And we need to stop doing that. That's one part of doing a better job. I think the other part of doing a better job of showing that value is actually changing the way we do research, because and we'll need you for that. Because if you accept that academics get promoted or have a KPI, and that main KPI is research, they'll do it anyhow. Meaning what you can influence is in what context they do, and meaning requesting or sometimes even sponsoring from them the answers to the questions that you're actually asking. They can do this kind of stuff, but it will require mostly PR scholars of this generation to think more about the business terms. If you look at most of the PR researchers of Sarab, much younger than me, of course, and my generation, most of us are social scientists rather than having been trained in business or in economics. And that means we need to make a conscious effort to build that bridge. But we're not going to do that if nobody's pushing us, and that's where we're going to ask for your pushiness. And out of that collaboration will come part of the answer. Conducive complacency. I'm fully aware that there are great exceptions to this, and that's what I meant when I said I don't think everybody individually or even agencies or organizations are culprits, but as a system we are too often complacent, and too often we know about it and the other side is complacent as well, and we're not changing it. And if we don't watch out, that becomes too much of conducive complacency. But I'll immediately agree that that is not necessarily the motivational driver for great agencies like yours and some other great universities as well that basically don't fit that mold.
We will take this offline. Thank you so much, appreciate it. So Sarab and Gregor, thank you so much.